Hello there, my friends. Let me start with a question that might catch you off guard. What if I told you that turning 80 wasn't the beginning of decline, but rather the start of the most authentic, liberated, and potentially fulfilling decade of your entire life? I know, that's not what you hear on the evening news or read in those depressing articles about aging. But stick with me for the next half hour, because I'm about to share something with you that took me nearly 8 decades to fully understand. My name is Walter, and at 82 years young, I've spent the last 45 years as a health advisor, helping folks navigate the challenges and opportunities that come with what we politely call the golden years. But here's what nobody prepared me for when I crossed that threshold into my 9th decade. The changes that happened at 80 aren't just physical, they're profound, unexpected, and if you know how to work with them instead of against them, they can transform your life in ways that will surprise and delight you. You see, 3 years ago, when I was 79 and thought I had aging all figured out, I experienced something that completely shifted my perspective. It was a Tuesday morning in October. I remember it clearly because the maple tree outside my kitchen window was at peak color, blazing red and gold like nature's own celebration. I was sitting at my breakfast table, same as I had thousands of mornings before, when I realized something profound. I didn't want to read the newspaper. Now, that might not sound like much to you, but understand, I had read the morning paper religiously for 60+ years. It was as much a part of my routine as brushing my teeth. But that morning, looking at the headlines full of conflict and chaos, I found myself thinking, Walter, you don't have to do this anymore. And just like that, I pushed the paper aside and spent the morning watching that maple tree instead, noticing details I'd missed for 20 years of living in that house. That moment was my first glimpse into what I now understand are the 5 inevitable changes that happen when we reach our 80s. Changes that our culture treats like losses, but which are actually evolutions, transformations that can lead to more joy, authenticity, and peace than you might have experienced in decades. Over the past 3 years, working with hundreds of clients who've crossed this same threshold, and going through it myself, I've identified 5 specific changes that happen to virtually everyone who reaches 80. These aren't things that might happen or could happen. These are changes that will happen. But here's the key. When you understand them, prepare for them, and learn to work with them, instead of fighting them, some of the most liberating experiences of your entire life. The first change, your energy and sleep patterns transform completely. Let me tell you about my client, Margaret, a 79-year-old retired librarian who came to see me in absolute panic last spring. Walter, she said, wringing her hands, something's wrong with me. I'm going to bed at 8 o'clock at night and waking up at 4:30 in the morning. I feel like I'm becoming some kind of strange bird. I had to laugh, not at Margaret, but because she was describing my exact experience and the experience of virtually every client I'd worked with who had crossed into their 80s. What Margaret was experiencing wasn't a problem to be fixed. It was her body's natural evolution to what researchers call advanced circadian rhythm. Here's what happens that nobody tells you about. When you reach 80, your biological clock doesn't just shift slightly, it transforms completely. Your body starts operating on what I call sunrise schedule. You naturally want to go to bed earlier, sometimes as early as 7 or 8 o'clock, and wake up before dawn. This isn't insomnia or a sleep disorder. It's your body optimizing for a different phase of life. The energy pattern that comes with this sleep shift is equally dramatic. Instead of the relatively steady energy levels you might have maintained through your 60s and 70s, your 80s bring what I call morning surge, afternoon dip. Your highest energy, clearest thinking, and best mood typically occur in the first 4 to 6 hours after you wake up. Then, somewhere between 1 and 3 in the afternoon, you hit what feels like a wall. I discovered this pattern in my own life about 2 years ago. For months, I was fighting it, trying to force myself to stay up later, drinking extra coffee in the afternoon, scheduling important meetings in the evening. I was exhausted and frustrated, convinced that something was wrong with me. Then I had a conversation with Dr. Sarah Chin, a geriatrician who specializes in sleep patterns in older adults. "Walter," she said after I described my struggles, "you're fighting your body's natural optimization. At 80, your brain is restructuring itself for efficiency. Those early morning hours when you feel most alert, that's when your cognitive function is at its absolute peak. The afternoon dip isn't a problem. It's your body telling you to rest so you can maintain that morning clarity." That conversation changed everything for me. Instead of fighting my new rhythm, I embraced it completely. I started scheduling all my important work, my client consultations, my writing, and my complex thinking tasks between 5 and 11 in the morning. I began treating those early hours like precious gold, protecting them fiercely from interruptions or trivial activities. The afternoon dip became my rest and restoration time. Instead of fighting fatigue with caffeine, I started taking what I call a wisdom nap, 20 to 30 minutes of rest that left me refreshed for evening activities with my wife Eleanor and friends. The transformation was remarkable. My productivity in those morning hours was higher than it had been in years. My thinking was clearer, my energy was more sustainable, and I stopped feeling like I was constantly swimming against the current of my own biology. Here's the practical solution that I now teach all my clients. Embrace your golden hour strategy. Identify when your energy peaks. For most people in their 80s, it's the first 4 to 6 hours after waking. Schedule everything important during those hours: medical appointments, financial decisions, creative projects, meaningful conversations, challenging physical activities. Protect these hours like a fortress. No television, no browsing the internet, no trivial tasks. Then plan for the afternoon dip instead of fighting it. Accept that your energy will naturally decrease and use that time for gentle activities, light reading, pleasant socializing, simple hobbies, meal preparation. Don't schedule anything demanding or stressful during your low energy period. Margaret embraced this approach completely. 6 months later, she told me, "Walter, I feel like I've discovered a superpower. My morning hours are more productive than entire days used to be. And I've stopped feeling guilty about needing rest in the afternoon. Just part of my natural rhythm now." The second change, your social circle naturally transforms. This might be the change that surprises people the most, and it's one that can cause significant distress if you don't understand what's happening. When you reach your 80s, your social relationships don't just change slightly. They undergo what I call the great sorting. I experienced this firsthand about 18 months ago, and it initially caused me considerable anxiety. I started noticing that some friendships that had been part of my life for decades were naturally fading away, not because of arguments or conflicts, but simply because they no longer felt necessary. At the same time, other relationships were becoming deeper and more meaningful than they had ever been. The friendship that made me realize what was happening was with Bob, a guy I had played golf with Thursday for 15 years. Bob was a good man, don't get me wrong, but our friendship had been built around routine and convenience rather than genuine connection. We talked about golf, the weather, and complained about politics, but we never really talked about anything that mattered. One Thursday morning, I was getting ready for our usual round when I suddenly realized I didn't want to go. Not because I was tired or busy, but because those 3 hours spent in superficial conversation felt like a waste of precious time. It was a startling realization. Time had become precious to me in a way it never had before. Meanwhile, my friendship with Henry, a neighbor I had known casually for years, was deepening in unexpected ways. Henry had lost his wife the previous year, and we started having coffee together on Saturday morns. Our conversations were different. We talked about loss, about meaning, about what really mattered. We shared stories from our pasts, discussed our fears and hopes, and found ourselves laughing together in ways that felt both comfortable and profound. What I was experiencing, I learned, is what psychologists call socio-emotional selectivity. As we become aware that our time is finite, not in a morbid way, but in a realistic way, our brains naturally start prioritizing relationships that provide genuine emotional satisfaction and meaning. The research on this is fascinating. Studies show that people in their 80s naturally gravitate toward what researchers call emotionally meaningful relationships while allowing peripheral social contacts to fade away. This isn't antisocial behavior or depression. It's actually a sign of emotional intelligence and wisdom. I saw this pattern repeatedly with my clients. Eleanor, an 81-year-old former teacher, told me, "Walter, I used to feel obligated to maintain friendships with everyone I had ever known. I was exhausted trying to keep up with people I didn't really enjoy spending time with. Now I have 3 close friends instead of 20 casual ones, and I'm happier than I've been in years." The practical solution here is what I call conscious relationship duration. Give yourself permission to let some friendships naturally fade without guilt. This doesn't mean being rude or cutting people off abruptly, but it does mean stopping the effort to maintain relationships that don't bring you joy or meaning. At the same time, be open to deepening connections with people who do resonate with you, even if those relationships haven't been close in the past. Some of my most meaningful friendships now are with people I barely knew 5 years ago, but who share values, interests, or perspectives that matter to me. The key is recognizing that this social transformation isn't a loss. It's an upgrade. You're moving from quantity to quality, from obligation to choice, from surface-level interaction to genuine connection. The third change, your relationship with time and priorities, completely reverses. This change might be the most liberating thing that happens in your 80s, but it can also be the most disorienting if you're not prepared for it. What happens is this: you suddenly, clearly, viscerally understand that time is finite, not in an anxious, death-obsessed way, but in a clarifying, prioritizing, surprisingly freeing way. I remember the exact moment this shift happened for me. I was at my grandson's soccer game, sitting in those uncomfortable bleachers, making small talk with other grandparents about topics that didn't interest me, watching a game I didn't particularly enjoy. It was a Saturday afternoon, one of my precious Saturday afternoons, and I suddenly thought, "Walter, why are you here?" Don't misunderstand me. I love my grandson dearly, but I realized I was at that game because I thought I was supposed to be there, not because I wanted to be there, or because my presence was actually meaningful to anyone. I was following script of what a grandfather should do, rather than making conscious choices about how to spend my limited time. That realization led to what I now call the great priority reversal. Instead of living by other people's expectations, I started living by my own values. Instead of saying yes to things out of obligation, I started saying no to preserve time and energy for what truly mattered to me. The transformation was remarkable and, honestly, a little scary at first. I stopped attending social events that felt like duties rather than pleasures. I resigned from committees where I wasn't making a meaningful contribution. I stopped reading books I wasn't enjoying just because I felt I should finish them. I even stopped watching television shows out of habit rather than genuine interest. My wife Eleanor was initially concerned about these changes. "Walter," she said, "you're becoming antisocial." But what was actually happening was the opposite. I was becoming more intentionally social. The time I freed up from obligatory activities, I spent on things that brought me genuine joy and connection. I started having weekly lunch dates with my daughter Sarah, something we had talked about doing for years but never prioritized. I began volunteering at the literacy center, working one-on-one with adult learners who genuinely appreciated my help. I took up watercolor painting, something I had been interested in for decades, but never had time for. The psychological research calls this mortality salient, but that sounds much more morbid than the actual experience. What really happens is that awareness of life's limitations becomes a clarifying force that helps you distinguish between what matters and what doesn't. My client Robert, an 83-year-old retired engineer, described it perfectly. "Walter, it's like I've been carrying a heavy backpack full of other people's rocks for 70 years, and I suddenly realized I could just set it down." The practical application of this change is what I call ruthless prioritization. Start by making a list of how you currently spend your time, not how you think you spend it, but how you actually spend it. Be honest about what brings you joy, meaning, or satisfaction, and what you do purely out of habit or obligation. Then, begin the gentle but firm process of eliminating the obligation-based activities that don't serve you. This doesn't mean becoming selfish or inconsiderate, but it does mean recognizing that your time and energy are precious resources that deserve to be invested wisely. The freedom that comes from this shift is extraordinary. Many of my clients describe it as finally being able to breathe, or feeling like themselves for the first time in decades. The fourth change, your memory and thinking restructure in unexpected ways. This change is probably the one that causes the most anxiety, because our culture has taught us to fear any changes in cognitive function. But what actually happens to your brain in your 80s is far more complex and in many ways far more positive than the simple memory decline narrative that dominates our conversations about aging. Yes, certain types of memory function change. Your short-term memory, remembering where you put your keys, recalling names of people you just met, keeping track of appointments, often becomes less reliable. Processing speed can slow down, meaning it might take longer to work through complex problems or learn new information. But here's what nobody tells you. While these changes are happening, other cognitive abilities are actually improving. Your capacity for what researchers call crystallized intelligence, the ability to connect experiences, recognize patterns, and apply accumulated wisdom, reaches its peak in your 80s. I discovered this personally during a consultation with a client named Dorothy, a retired nurse who was struggling with memory concerns. Dorothy came to me feeling embarrassed and frustrated because she kept forgetting appointments and had trouble remembering new names. "Walter," she said, "I feel like I'm losing my mind." But as we talked, I realized that Dorothy's ability to analyze complex situations, offer insightful advice, and see connections between seemingly unrelated problems was extraordinary. When another client, James, was struggling with depression following his wife's death, Dorothy immediately recognized patterns from her 40 years of nursing experience and offered guidance that was both compassionate and practical. "Dorothy," I told her, "your brain isn't declining, it's specializing. You're transitioning from a high-speed processing model to a deep wisdom model. This cognitive restructuring is actually an evolutionary advantage. Research shows that brains in their 80s become exceptionally good at what scientists call executive function, making decisions, solving complex problems, and providing guidance based on accumulated experience." My own experience with this transition was initially frustrating, but ultimately enlightening. I started having trouble remembering details like phone numbers, appointment times, and grocery lists. But simultaneously, I found that my ability to help clients navigate complex life decisions had never been better. I could see patterns in their situations that I might have missed when I was younger and more focused on processing speed. The practical solution is what I call memory partnership and wisdom amplification. For the short-term memory challenges, develop external support systems. Use calendars, lists, phone reminders, and organizational tools without shame. Think of these as cognitive prosthetics, helpful tools that free your brain to focus on higher-level functions. At the same time, actively cultivate and share your wisdom-based abilities. Look for opportunities to mentor, advise, or guide others. Your brain's new configuration makes you exceptionally well-suited for roles that require judgment, perspective, and the ability to see the big picture. I now tell all my clients, don't mourn the loss of your 20-year-old brain. Celebrate the emergence of your 80-year-old brain. It's designed for different work, but it's incredibly powerful work. The fifth change, your authenticity and freedom, emerge like never before. This final change might be the most profound and liberating transformation of all, but it's also the one that can feel the most unsettling at first. What happens in your 80s is that the social masks, roles, and expectations that have shaped your behavior for decades start to feel less important, less binding, and frankly, less interesting. You begin to experience what I call authentic emergence, a powerful drive to be genuinely yourself, often for the first time since childhood. I witnessed this transformation most dramatically in my client Ruth, a 79-year-old woman who had spent her entire adult life being what she called the good wife, the good mother, the good neighbor. Ruth had always dressed conservatively, spoken carefully, and made decisions based on what others would think appropriate. Then, shortly after her 80th birthday, Ruth showed up to our appointment wearing a bright purple sweater and turquoise jewelry. Her hair, which had been the same conservative style for 30 years, was now shorter and more modern. But the most striking change wasn't in her appearance, it was in her demeanor. "Walter," she said with a smile I had never seen before, "I've decided I don't care what people think anymore, and it's the most liberating feeling I've ever experienced." Ruth went on to explain that she had started expressing opinions she had kept to herself for years. She had begun pursuing interests like learning to play the banjo and taking a pottery class that she had always been too concerned about looking foolish to try. She had even started declining social invitations that didn't genuinely interest her, something that would have been unthinkable for her just a year earlier. "I spent 79 years trying to be the person everyone else expected me to be," she told me. "Now, I'm finally discovering who I actually am." This authentic emergence isn't just about individual personality. It affects relationships in profound ways. When you stop performing social roles and start being genuinely yourself, your relationships become more honest, more satisfying, and more meaningful. My own experience with this change was gradual but transformative. I started expressing political opinions I had kept to myself for years in professional settings. I began wearing clothes I actually liked, rather than what seemed appropriate for a health advisor. I started declining social invitations that felt like work rather than pleasure. Most significantly, I began sharing more of my real thoughts and feelings with Eleanor, my wife of 54 years. Our conversations became deeper, more honest, and more intimate than they had been in decades. The psychological research on this phenomenon is fascinating. Studies show that people in their 80s report higher levels of authenticity, self-acceptance, and personal autonomy than any other age group. This isn't because circumstances become easier. Often they become more challenging. It's because the psychological need to maintain social facades diminishes dramatically. Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist who studies aging and authenticity, explained it to me this way. When people reach their 80s, they often experience what we call liberation from social performance anxiety. The opinions of others become less important than living in alignment with their own values and preferences. The practical application of this change is what I call authentic living permission. Give yourself explicit permission to be who you actually are, not who you think you should be. This might mean changing how you dress, how you spend your time, what opinions you express, or what relationships you prioritize. It might mean trying new things that interest you, regardless of whether they seem age-appropriate. It might mean speaking up about things that matter to you, even if your opinions aren't popular. It might mean changing long-standing patterns or traditions that no longer serve you. The freedom that comes from authentic living is extraordinary. Client after client tells me that their 80s have become the most genuinely happy period of their adult lives, not because circumstances are perfect, but because they're finally living as themselves. Bringing it all together, the evolutionary perspective. Now let me tie all of this together for you, because understanding these 5 changes as a complete transformation, rather than individual challenges, is crucial to embracing your 80s as the gift they can be. What's happening when you reach 80 isn't decline, it's evolution. Your body is optimizing for a different kind of life. Your energy patterns are restructuring to support deep thinking and meaningful activity during your peak hours. Your social instincts are guiding you toward relationships that provide genuine satisfaction. Your relationship with time is helping you focus on what truly matters. Your cognitive abilities are specializing in wisdom and judgment, and your authentic self is finally free to emerge without the constraints of social performance anxiety. When you understand these changes as evolutionary advantages rather than losses, everything shifts. Instead of fighting against your new rhythms, you work with them. Instead of mourning the loss of your younger self, you celebrate the emergence of your wiser self. I've seen this transformation in hundreds of clients, and I've lived it myself. The people who thrive in their 80s are those who embrace these changes, Work with them and discover the unique gifts that this stage of life offers. My client Helen, now 84, put it beautifully. Walter, I spent the first 80 years of my life becoming who I was supposed to be. Now I'm spending however many years I have left being who I actually am. And you know what? I like myself a lot better this way. The practical path forward. So how do you prepare for and embrace these changes? Here's what I recommend based on 3 years of personal experience and professional observation. First, start adjusting your expectations and schedule around your new energy patterns. Experiment with protecting your high energy hours for important activities and allowing yourself rest during low energy periods. Second, give yourself permission to let some relationships naturally evolve while deepening others. Quality over quantity isn't just a nice idea. It's a biological imperative at this stage of life. Third, begin the process of ruthless prioritization. Start saying no to obligations that don't serve you and yes to activities that bring genuine satisfaction. Fourth, develop external support systems for memory challenges while celebrating and utilizing your growing wisdom and judgment abilities. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, start the journey toward authentic living. Give yourself permission to be who you actually are, not who you think you should be. The gift of perspective. Let me close with this thought. I've had the privilege of working with people at every stage of adult life, from their 30s through their 90s. And here's what I've observed. The people in their 80s who have embraced these changes are often the happiest, most content, most genuinely satisfied people I know. They're not happy because their lives are perfect or because they don't face challenges. They're happy because they've finally learned to live authentically, to prioritize meaningfully, and to appreciate deeply. They've discovered that aging isn't just about loss. It's also about liberation. Your 80s aren't the end of your story. They're potentially the most authentic, liberated, and satisfying chapter you've ever written. These 5 changes that seem so challenging at first are actually invitations to a kind of freedom and authenticity that younger people can only imagine. Embrace the evolution. Work with the changes instead of against them. And discover, as I have, that turning 80 isn't the beginning of decline. It's the beginning of becoming who you were always meant to be. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Remember, every day you live authentically is a gift to yourself and to everyone who has the privilege of knowing the real you.